So I will open for questions now and any comments, but please feel free to send them into the chat. So if there's any questions that you have about potential ways to get involved or potential ways to create engagement, please feel free. So a question I am often asked is sort of other areas and other consumers that can be brought into this and the sort of impact. And we spoke a lot about sort of the change that research can have, and organizations that are funding bodies, so for example in TAC, what have you, many, or NDIS sort of globally in Australia, is that a lot of the change that comes through there is generally research funded, research backed. So often there's a frustration around things like, well, we wish this was funded, we wish that was funded. And a way to change that is by getting sort of research backed into those interventions. And then that sort of creates an avenue for change. And that's a really important area of consumers as well, is that the ability to change the funding body and through by providing answers and research. So question, there is so much research being done. What is the best way to keep up to date with it all? Thank you for the question. So as I was saying, it's probably, to keep up to date with it all is probably really difficult. My suggestion to that would be to really narrow it down to the research that's important to your life or your practice and focus on those areas. And as I said before, the Sky Project is really great resource with that, but also doing your own research as well. And for example, you're also looking for the latest research. So when you are going through searches, to really narrow down the filters to things like dates, so maybe keep it within a couple of years. And the other thing with that as well, it's probably important to be really proactive. So it depends how often you're looking it up as well. But my advice to that would be to be, extremely specific in what you're looking for, because that can be a challenge as well. But so to the point that there is so much research that you really need to narrow it down to what it is that you're searching for. But that's a really, really good and important question. And part of that as well, to be perfectly honest, is knowing the right places to search. And as I mentioned before, it's important to be engaged in where to look for research, but also through sort of keeping up to date by actually getting involved. By actually getting involved in research yourself, you sort of plug yourself in. You sort of plug yourself in to the information, and as I said before, around the partnerships and the knowledge translation side of it. Okay, so there's a question. I don't have a university education. How could I be of help in research other than a subject? Yeah, so that's a question that does come up. It's through sharing perspective. So it's a lot of times you don't have to worry about your qualification as a barrier. Your experience of living with a spinal cord injury is something that researchers don't have, and sort of sometimes you got to not think about the actual academic side of it rather than the lived experience side. So I would encourage that even though you don't have a university education, that you get involved, because you're sharing experience and you're storytelling. Okay. Examples of research being done in partnership with consumers, and what are the pros and cons? Yeah, there are examples at the moment. So I just the other day was part of a conversation around the use of virtual reality. There are studies going on at the moment with the use of electrical stimulation as well that are involving consumers and consumers as consultants in those studies. So the best way to engage consumers in electrostimulation. So I know that there is co-design study going on in Australia in that. So it does happen a lot more across the study. And if anything, to answer that question, organisations like the TAC and other funding bodies are actually now demanding on funding applications that researchers do involve consumers in the methodology. The pros and cons, we sort of touched on that today, is that the pros are that you input lived experience into the research cycle so that the outcomes are best developed. Cons, that's a subjective one as well. So obviously, some of the cons would be that at the moment and it's not necessarily a kind of the involvement, it's maybe a kind of the process that there needs at the moment. There's not necessarily a framework to involving consumers, but it very much is encouraged. So a platform where SCI can share their research, people with SCI can share their research, so ideas. I'm not aware of one at the moment, but please feel free to email me and I'll be happy to have that conversation as well. Maybe it's something that could be developed. What's the most interesting research I have come across recently in Spinal? Oh, that's subjective. I read a lot of research. Personally, I read a lot of research around facilitators and barriers around people with disability getting involved, people with spinal cord injuries getting involved in employment. And I find that area personally really interesting. So looking at things like, discrimination and perceived discrimination, as well as, other societal barriers that look into that. So for me, that's probably the biggest area that I've looked in. And that sort of touches to that point of the question before about, how do I navigate through all the research? And once again, it comes down to what impacts you the most and being really specific in what you search for when it comes to searching for research. And on that as well, I will admit that the more you start searching for research, and sort of, it's like any skill, the more you do it, the better you get at it. You start understanding where to search, how to search. So actually how to search through different search engines, through different areas, and you might stumble across pages that you like, pages that you don't like as well. So, it's like any skill that can be developed over time. What do you think about studies without ethics approval? Is there a place for them? All right, studies without ethics approval. So it really depends who's doing the research. If it's a actual researcher going through a university and what have you, I would strongly suggest that they have an ethics approval. If it's an organization doing internal research, what have you, they're not necessarily compelled to have an ethics approval, but I would strongly recommend that research is done with an ethics approval. The other thing with that as well, if they don't meet an ethical requirement, a lot of studies won't necessarily get published as well. So it's actually in the best interest for the researcher and the research teams to have ethics approval. And is there a place for them? Like I said, in private organizations, then yes, I would imagine there's a place for them, but in sort of that academic world, no, because we do need to protect the rights of the participants as well. So if somebody participates in a survey, we sort of really need to be sure that they remain anonymous, if they're sharing information. Are researchers educated on how to support communities fully in the research cycle? Yeah, it's a really interesting question. At present, there is not necessarily a framework that researchers can use to engage consumers in the research cycle. There is a study that was released a couple of years ago called the IKT, so Integrated Knowledge Translation Guiding Principles, that outline how researchers should involve them, but a step-by-step framework, no. But yes, there is those guiding principles. Any hints from a provider on how to? Okay, sorry. Any hints from a provider perspective on how to promote and engage our clients to be active citizen scientists rather than traditional passive participants? From a provider perspective, my advice would be to engage in research yourself and then get your clients involved in that process. So that's something that, as a provider, engage with the researcher, but then when you're engaging with them, ask your clients to be involved in that process early, so you can really take the lead in doing that. So yeah, really be proactive in engaging in the research with the researcher, but during the process, actually asking them to come through. Platforms for resources for research, journal, practice, RSRI. So as I said, the Sky project is probably a great platform for research, and they keep that up to date and they write that in information. The thing with journals is that it's like anything. There's a lot of information in journals, and they can be monotonous to read, where platforms like the Sky project is probably a really good resource on that. And once again, it depends on the type of research you're trying to look up. And like I said, I'll really ensure that you narrow your search to be really specific to what you're looking for.